there's a vast amount of confusion out there. We actually, among many hats, too many hats I wear, I work with an organization in Bristol called Future Leap, which basically has a hub that brings all the different strands of sustainability to one place, domestic and business and shared workspace and events and consultancy. So I'm one of the carbon consultants there. And that there's a synergistic relationship between Future Leap and Carbon Lens, the company I and two other guys, soon to be three other guys, work with. We do quite a lot of training, but you get people coming in just obviously very bemused. So we run Davina, who organizes the events, very neat hybrid events, online and in person in the event space, just on carbon jargon. So you just run through the big terms, a footprint, how you work out a footprint, what neutrality is and isn't, whether neutrality will get you to net zero, which it won't. It's a way of sidestepping the big issues, what net zero actually means, and then what on earth you do about it. How do you reduce your footprint, which is what they really want to know. And of course, unfortunately, this whole slightly chaotic, very new horizon is a huge opportunity for greenwash. So people will claim nice eco this, green that. So this is where you get, drive carbon neutral, big oil company, fly carbon neutral, completely impossible. An electric aeroplane might get you to Scotland. It won't get you across an ocean. And the aviation industry, one of the Carbon Lens directors is from the aviation industry. So he's tracking this quite closely. They haven't got the technology. It's really pushing the limit of what's technically possible. So you try to unpick the truth from the greenwash. It's very, very confusing. I think confusion is a route to inaction, and that's very dangerous. So our humble mission in the middle of all this, it sounds ridiculously grandiose to say it like this, but somebody's got to do it in every point, local activity. Somebody has got to make it much more transparent. So you unpick the confusion, you explain very simply what the terms are, and then you give examples, and stories are unbelievably powerful, because stories of a business that you can identify with who did something that worked. Now we've finally got a foothold in some sort of carbon reduction plan. So it is chaotic, but my background is neuroscience, so I'm used to chaos. This doesn't bother me. And so the organizations that prosper, that's why I like working with Future Leap. I warn everybody, they're all quite young. I'm sort of granddad. If you like being perpetually out of your depth because things are changing around you, even as you carry something out, if you love the excitement and the buzz from that you can never be completely sure what's going to happen, but you'll cope with it somehow, you'll love it. But if you like predictability, then you're going to hate the whole thing. But there's nothing predictable in it unless you go right to the heart of it and look at the examples of what people have done that have worked. But of course, the context is changing as well. So everything is moving, which I just love it. It's incredibly exciting. Interesting.
And to be honest, I think, this is episode 300 of the Neil Wilkins podcast. And I think, it's an absolute, well, thank you. But congratulations for you, actually, for being here at this kind of poignant moment, I guess, of hopefully it's a turning point, because I don't know about you, Simon, but and by the way, anybody watching, listening to this, we're talking with Simon Forsyth, who is a neurobiologist, but also system developer at Carbon Lens, as he sort of eloquently just described a little bit earlier. But I thought I'd put that placeholder there so that we know who we're talking to, and we'll explain a little bit more about Carbon Lens in a while.
I would just point out an interesting clarity. I haven't been a neurobiologist for an awfully long time. There was no funding in the 80s, so I went through AI and got into environmental and then carbon management. So the chaos, see?
Yeah, I was going to sort of really begin with that, I think, just in terms of kind of the journey, because I think people are always very interested in kind of, but how did you get into this? Chaos, it feels, this kind of embracing constant change. Why would you do that? Why would you go there? What is the backstory for Simon? Why did you kind of, or do you know how you kind of arrived at this point?
it's all happenstance, which is why I accept things are chaotic, because it's just how everything has happened in my career. It just seems to be, it's just me. It's just, I don't know. It wasn't exactly planned. Neuroscience was because I just thought that what of all the things to study, in your skull is the most complex matter in the known universe. And somehow there's the inner world that we perceive, and there's what we think is the outer world, but we don't know directly because we have to construct it in this complex matter. And I thought, wow, philosophically, scientifically. So I did a degree in that at Sussex, loved it. And then I worked for a year in the publishers, and then in London, and discovered if you've been working, you could get a full grant to do a PhD. And though I'd sworn I wouldn't ever go back to a educational institution, the institution, I thought, no, I really want to pursue this. So I did a PhD in basically cortical structures, how the almost crystalline structure in the cerebral cortex or the cerebellum does this myriad of different, very complex tasks and pulls order out of the chaos. So fascinating, which is great. Very, very interesting. Got me into computer modeling and so forth. No funding, mid-80s, nobody was interested in pure research. But one of my colleagues at Sheffield, where I'd done the PhD, had just got a job with British Telecom, who was starting an artificial intelligence group. And he said, why don't you apply? I said, I don't know anything about artificial intelligence. He said, well, you've been using the AI Vision Group's computer. I was allowed to use it overnight when nobody else was using it, to do brain models. I was modeling cortical structures and electrical sensation in fish, which is another story. So just, that's fine, that's close enough. So I went for an interview and got offered a job working in AI, about which I knew absolutely nothing. AI in the 80s was very different from what it is now. It was very fringe, very niche, and it was handcrafted. So you'd interview an expert to produce an expert system where you would codify their specific, domain-specific specialist knowledge into a set of rules, which are known as a production system, because you would produce a solution to a problem from looking through this set of rules, which is not how it's done now. That's another talk altogether. Did that for a while, and then HP, Hewlett Packard, were setting up a very large AI group. This was 85, and they wanted to recruit. They had a target to recruit at least 200 AI researchers. So the whole group, I can probably tell the story now without annoying BT too much. The entire AI group, there were only 5 of us, applied, and we got taken on. So suddenly I was part of this American multinational, which is actually a really nice culture in many ways. Bill Hewlett and Dave Packard, by the way, started Silicon Valley and Dave Packard's garage in 1938 or 9. They were Stanford graduates who just decided at their professor's suggestion to start a business. So it's a very, if we don't know how to do it, we'll just work it out, crash into it, see what happens. So they sort of embraced the technical chaos. It was part of the corporate culture. Part of the culture, I was in the research labs, supposedly researching, well, I was researching artificial intelligence, sort of. Well, no, we were really doing that. Prolog, logic programming, to do all sorts of things. But we were allowed 10% of our time, half a day a week, to do whatever the hell we liked, which is very prescient. The theory being management theory. I don't know much about management theory, but little snippets. You hire clever people, motivated people. So don't contain them too much. If they've got an idea that really gives them a buzz, just let them run with it, because something may come out of it. Google, by the way, give their staff 20% of their time, 1 day a week, to do whatever they think might be interesting. And I believe Google Maps and Google Translate, I think, came out of a particular, 1 or 2 employees who had a particular idea. So anyway, 10% of your time, you could do whatever you wanted. So a colleague of mine, who's now a professor at the University of Bristol, had noticed that all the paper from 100 and odd networked laser jets, Hewlett Packard, so we had a lot of printers in the 80s, it was all just going into the waste. And he thought, that's just not right. So rather than being an academic, his dad's a professor as well, he just phoned Friends of the Earth direct and said, look, is there any way of getting this recycled? Friends of the Earth in Bristol had just spun off a company specifically for business waste recycling, resource saver. So they said, yeah, you could be our first big client. So without telling the management, Friends of the Earth turned up once a week and took away all the waste paper. So it got recycled rather than going into landfill. And he asked people to help. So I just became the owner of a flip-top bin next to a printer, and I tipped it into the big bin in the print room once a week or whenever it was full. And then it went off and got recycled. Then a few months later, Chris was away. So I was sort of notionally in charge of things. There was an email from the general manager who said, I think we should be doing some recycling. This was early 1990. So there was a lot of concern. Those of you who are old enough will remember there were a lot of seal deaths in the North Sea. Britain was being seen as the dirty man of Europe because of acid rain that was blowing over to Germany and Scandinavia from power stations. There was a lot of environmental concern. The hole in the ozone layer had been uncovered by the British Antarctic Survey, as it happened. There's an interesting story behind that, why they discovered it, not the Americans. That's another story. So there was a lot of environmental concern, and the general manager felt we ought to be doing something. So I emailed him back and said, well, actually, we've been paper recycling since last summer. And I got an email, see me. I thought, oh no, this is being summoned to the headmaster's study. I'm going to get a massive bollocking now for not involving the management. But I was thinking British management. He was thinking California management, different. So in fact, it was the facilities manager I would summon to see. And instead of giving me a bollocking, he gave me a budget. He said, this is great that you've done this. What else can we do? So write me a plan of what we can do and get as many people involved as you could. So I went away and just out of the blue and thought, right, well, what are the areas we can look at? So we set up employee teams looking at waste, which we more or less had the beginnings of, chemicals, which were pretty very tightly managed for health and safety, but we looked at the environmental side of it as well. We were essentially picking up what was already there. Transport, this is the Bristol North Fringe, so we were beginning to generate an awful lot of traffic. The grounds, so that was basically ecology, because it was on the Hewlett Packard site was on 140 acres of old farmland. So we looked at these different, and energy is the other big one. There was a lot going on with energy in terms of it was well managed, but nobody was really asking the environmental, certainly not at that stage, the carbon question about energy use and how much we need to use. So we just sent a general email out, got groups of employees together for each of these environmental action group, we called them EAGs, looking at transport, energy, waste, the grounds, and chemicals and or pollution to see what we could do from ground level up. And it all worked fine. So for some accidental reason, I was in charge of it. And then after about 5 years, let's just say, didn't do quite as well as we possibly should have done in a big environmental audit, environment, health and safety audit, mostly on the environmental element, because there was a health and safety guy in charge who just wasn't particularly interested and didn't really. It's quite a different culture, health and safety, because it's very well defined, whereas environment, especially back then, there was hardly anything written. You were making it up as you went along. So the two cultures were really quite different, and he hadn't really taken down the environmental bit. So I got a job offer. And they said, could you write a job description? So I had to write my own job description. Then they gave me a really hard interview, and I thought, you're not going to give me the job, are you? Yeah, but actually they did. So suddenly I shifted sideways. See what I mean about chaos? Suddenly I was the environmental specialist, expected to know about all of this stuff. Of course I didn't. I knew bits. I'd done lots of reading. So I'd suddenly shifted careers completely. And of course I had to move then out of the research labs into the factory. It was a factory making digital audio tape, which turned over just short of $1 billion just from that one site by the late 90s, I think it was 98, 99 financial year. So it's pretty successful business. And I was the environmental lead. A part of the reporting for that was carbon. We didn't need to be. It just seemed like an obvious thing to work out because you could, but only very partial. So just for the mostly for energy, we didn't really have the means to calculate carbon for most things because the greenhouse gas protocol wasn't put together until the late 90s. It was published in 2001. So it wasn't really, it wasn't something that was easy to manage, but because you could work out, at least from energy, I just included it in and just started doing environmental reports, piece of software to pull the numbers together. Originally written in Lotus 123, but Lotus was then bought by IBM, so I wasn't then allowed to use it because IBM were a major competitor. So that shifted it across to Excel, which I still use, actually. Surprising how much you can do in Excel. So that got me into producing carbon tracking software very, very early on. And I left HP in 2000. I'd been mostly in charge of the ISO 14001 system, but then manufacturing was moving offshore, which was that was a bit sad, because the idea of making it here in England and selling it to the world, historical echoes, it's quite a nice idea, especially if it's something nobody else can really make, but it was too expensive to manufacture in the UK. So that was moved offshore. Didn't need a 14001 system on the site. So I was told I would always have a job, but it wouldn't necessarily be environmental. And I thought, it's probably time to move. So I went and worked, I won't give you all the detail, for various, usually charities, essentially working with small businesses, much smaller, not corporate level, because there's very little support for smaller businesses. There's a very, very little support for them now. But the gist there, well, let's just say there was funding made available, different age, through landfill tax, thing called the BREW program, Business Resource Efficiency for Waste. There was funding if you organized and ran a resource efficiency club, as it was then known. This is about 2004 to 2008. So I wrote bids and got and worked with colleagues to run a resource efficiency club. But part of the reporting, interestingly, you had to report. So it's a group of businesses. You get them together, ideally on a business site. So people are business people are much keener to go and visit another site, another business, because they can have a look around and talk to them and bounce ideas. So we discovered that's a very cheap way to get a good venue. And then, of course, you do a site tour. So people love describing what they've done and how they've done it. But everybody else, it's another group of businesses. It's non-competitive stuff. So they love sharing the ideas. So these are quite successful. But we had to report, and we were talking about a group of, I ended up running 3. Again, there was chaos in this. The third one was accidental because the Environment Agency had funds left over. So I was asked to work on a whole trading estate in South Bristol. And we put that together in less than a month. But they were all doing more or less the same thing, gathering the information about everything they consumed. And then we were getting businesses to share ideas about how you reduce your consumption, which cuts your cost. So it's 3 C's: consumption, cost, carbon. If you reduce your consumption, you're reducing your cost base, which is actually increasing your profitability, because your cost of producing whatever you sell, goods, service, whatever, has gone down because you're consuming less. Therefore, there's more left over as profit margin. So it does make business sense, but it was, in those days, it was very marginal. But I'd learned by then, track the carbon as well. And we had to report cost saving, but also carbon saving. So the carbon reporting bit suddenly became center stage. And then when all of that funding stopped, somebody asked me, somebody I used to work with at a charity in Bath, now sadly long gone, Involve. She said, why can't you do all this in one place? Because you're writing a report in one, usually in Microsoft Word, you're doing the tracking in something else, Excel usually, and you're doing accessory bits. Can't you do all of this? And then you're giving them an action plan, which is a separate document of things they can do based on what they've told you. Can you not do all this in one piece of software? Just simplify. Oh, I don't know. Is it possible to do that in Excel? It turns out, so I gave myself, I think it was April 2008. I thought, right, I'm just going to see if we can actually do the data gathering, the carbon calculation, the reporting, and the action plan all in one place. It turns out you can. So I've been tweaking that ever since. It's called the data collator, because all it does is collate the data, but it's automatically working out the carbon in the background, because we now know we have mechanisms through the greenhouse gas protocol, protocols, procedures, methods for calculating the carbon that's emitted for every litre of fuel you burn or mile you travel in a small vehicle or an HGV, depends on the vehicle size, every kilowatt hour of electricity, gas, fuel oil, every ton of fuel oil if you need to, or ton of wood, you can work out how much carbon has been emitted. And because the greenhouse gas protocol gives you a structure, you can say, as is scope 1, stuff you control directly, so like vehicle fuel, gas oil, fuel oil, you burn directly, that's scope 1. Electricity, you're not usually generating it, though you might be if you've got photovoltaics on the roof, but you're influencing because you choose from whom you buy it. So that's scope 2. And then scope 3 is everything else. But because it's, don't worry about the detail. Come to one of the carbon jargon events and go through the detail. Because it's structured, we can automate all the calculation. So calculating the carbon isn't difficult. Well, it's fiddly, but it doesn't have to be a task every time because it's done automatically by the programming, by the machine. The difficult bit is gathering the raw data about everything you've consumed. And that's the model. So that sort of evolved out of the resource efficiency clubs. And then that's the model we still use, but too much detail. Spun off a company. I operated as 3Cs for a while and then got together with another friend, colleague whom I'd met earlier, and we formed Carbon Lens, just the two of us. And then his brother, who's the aviation industry, Airbus and General Electric, he joined. And the three of us, we're all my sort of age, so it's a sort of, it's a bit like Last of the Summer Wine does carbon sometimes. I see us at meetings and I think, however, the two of them bring enormous industrial experience. You've got Martin comes in from aviation. Richard he was production manager at RS Racing Sailboats. So it's manufacturing a world-class, Olympic-class product. So he's very good on the process stuff, and he's very good on the formal management system, ISO anything. He integrates them all, 27,000 for security, 9,000 for quality, 14,001 for 14,000 series for environmental. He can do all of that stuff. Frankly, I get a bit bored with all the paperwork. I'm much more interested in the performance stuff. So, and of course, I come in from electronics. So you bring a lot of industrial background together, and then we work with all sorts of businesses, come in, they have a particular problem. So that's how, by a series of random stages and conversations, communications, friendships, casual references, interesting conversations, that's how it's all sort of formed itself up. So it is chaotic, but I can tell you, this is what is happening inside your skull all the time. The chaos of everything you're perceiving, it's a complete mess. And somehow what we're able to do is spot the patterns, pull the shapes out of the chaos, and that becomes what we perceive as reality. So I apply that model to organizations. You see organizations that, embrace the chaos. Structure will come out of it, and the structure is surprisingly stable. But also, you've got to do that with the carbon. The data looks chaotic, and it is, but there are structures in it. So one of the things we do with the software that I've been working on recently is visualizing the patterns that are coming out. In fact, I've got, I need to do some emails before too long. We've got training events on Monday and Tuesday working with forges, metal forming companies. This is a project run through the University of Birmingham on how they reduce their carbon, basically carbon reduction plan, because they're very heavy energy users because they have to melt or metal to the point where they can make it into a specific item. How can we reduce our carbon footprint? They ask. Very good question. So we will specialize on that. So you've got all of this going on. And what we've done is they have given us a whole load of data. Martin's put together a very neat tool, the C estimator, that from no more than a dozen or so. Sorry, this is that's little Ben, which is a grandmother clock, 100 years old, I think, this year. But it has a very, very big bomb, which seems to carry extremely well. So we'll know when it's 10 o'clock. What they've done, these companies, there's 8 of them, they've put about a dozen headline consumption numbers into the sea estimator. It's produced a footprint and a load of graphics about how much carbon they're emitting from which bits of their business. And what we'll be doing on Monday is going through, okay, what are the big generators in your business, carbon generators? What measures are possible? And looking at lots of other businesses. What have people tried? What's worked to reduce your carbon? That becomes a carbon reduction plan. And when you project that out over next year, the year after, 10 years, 2040, that's your net zero plan, because you're aiming to get your total emissions down to less than 10% of what they currently are, year by year, successive year by year improvements stepping down. And we've had clients, Carbon Lens has had clients who, there's one client in particular, it got business specifically because they had a carbon reduction plan. And this is tens of millions of pounds worth of business. It's a government contract, government now stipulate, UK government, bless them, I don't say that very often, actually stipulates that if you're bidding for more than, I think it's, they've bumped it up, I think it's 5 million now. No, I think it's less. I think it's more than 1 million. If you're bidding for a government contract, I think it's more than 1 million. Wales, it's more than 1 million. You have to have a net zero plan. And of course, we get phone calls. We need a net zero plan. What is one of those? Can you do us one by Monday? Well, no, you've got to rethink pretty well all your processes in order to put a coherent one together. But it's gone from a marginal nice to have, and it's become a pretty central business essential. The clue is in the name. You need to have this. And we now have, although don't get your hopes up too far, we now have an energy security and net zero department. I just hope somebody in there understands what net zero means. Otherwise, come to a seminar. We run them periodically. Anyway, he said that was arrogant, but anyway.
No, it's really interesting, because for me, the missing link, I think for lots of people, and I'm sure people listening to this fascinated by the journey, but the one key thing for me that was the missing link, but seems to be now with Carbon Lens, and I'm sure others are available, but we're talking here about Carbon Lens.
There's lots.
Is the whole kind of concept of having a playbook. So actually having something you can physically use, as you've eloquently described, to kind of talk and collaborate your way through that chaos. Because I think, as you described right at the outset there, that there's a lot of people knowing it's the thing to do. You know you have to do it. You know it's the right stuff to be involved in, but it is that question of how. And I think with something like this, there's a playbook available now. There are experts available who can guide you and talk you through it. This kind of still feels like new ground. It's really interesting, isn't it? Because when you talk about the broader sustainability kind of sector now, because it is a sector providing business support and specialist services, it feels like it is still kind of just an emerging sector, really, and it still feels very early in the game, despite obviously for you having been for decades.
Yeah, well, as you may have inferred from what I've said, I have this rather uncomfortable habit of arriving about 20 to 30 years early in an area, because neuroscience, where people go, what's that? So somebody once thought it was Euroscience, studying the science that's going on in Europe. I don't know, it's brains. Now it's really trendy. You say this to a 20-something, they go, wow, really? You studied that? AI, similarly, although it's not AI like we did it, it's machine learning. I try to persuade them to look at connection machines, neural nets, brain modeled AI, but nobody in the 80s was interested. It was all formal logic. And so I always arrive too early. It's just chaos again. But so it is very new. I mean, there's a group of some of my friends and colleagues get slightly peeved with me because I talk about us as the stubborn old Greens, because we've been doing this for decades. It was just what we call in Yorkshire sheer badness, sheer cussedness. Nope, this is the right thing to do. I'm going to do this. That. And there are a lot of them. And you say carbon lens is one. It's a point that's popped up, that's assembled itself, self-assembling systems, chaos, all linked. Tell them a biologist, can't you? There are lots of small groups. There's a real hub down in Exeter, for example. I did a lot of work down there, and Devon, York, Sheffield, all over. Our best hope for dealing with the climate crisis is that I actually say this as in the software, just in a note. The best hope is that there are little groups of people who said, right, somebody's got to do this. Let's just work out what we do and just get on with it. That there are thousands of them dotted all over the world. And there are. The reason I love working with the Future Leap people, who are mostly youngsters, is that you see a whole concentration of them. And there's a shared workspace as part of that. So they're all sustainability facing businesses. They're not all tiny, but it's a real mix. And it is all new. I mean, there's Reef Watch, Reef Conservation Worldwide. They're headquartered there. They're based there. It's basically a small charity. The software people who've spun off, I actually work with, working out spherics, working out your carbon from your cloud accountancy data. I got involved. I can't believe that's really possible. But if it is, it's brilliant. So I work with them. They've now been bought up they're part of Sage, because Sage now, who are headquartered in Newcastle, but global, they know this needs to be part of what they offer. So something started from an idea in the minds of 2 or 3 people, formed an organization. They were very canny how they did it, a lot of business experience, pulled a lot of people in, and then become part of a multinational. You think, oh, okay, that's an interesting model. So there's a sea change. There's a real, it's what we were talking about. Neil and I met at a Future Leap event like this in a breakout group online, and we just got chatting. So that's how I got asked to come and do this. There's an awful lot more than you can see happening out there, and that's the only thing. That and the people I meet involved in this, the only things that keep me optimistic. Because if you just look at the science, it's terrifying. You know, what's on our way is really frightening, but what's going on in response to that is really inspiring. How it's going to play out, I have no idea. It's a race against time now. Can this change happen fast enough for us to really adapt? Because what you see is that the established interests, they will put up tokens, net carbon neutral. Great, token. What's it mean? Fly carbon neutral. No, it's not possible. Drive carbon neutral. That was Shell. Go on. I'll say it. Right intent, but very badly. And yet, each of those organizations will find within them, there are groups of employees who are going, actually, look, there's another way of doing this. So this is kind of what we're talking about, Neil. There's a real cultural, psychological, emotional revolution going on below the surface. The interesting echo is that was more or less how the Industrial Revolution happened 300 years ago. It was people who weren't part of the system because they were non-conformists. They weren't Church of England. They couldn't go to Oxford or Cambridge, couldn't go to university in England. So they formed their own colleges, the dissenting academies. And instead of learning classics, their kids learned metallurgy and geology and the cutting edge, talking late 18th century, cutting edge science. Oxygen was just being discovered. Oh, what is it exactly? Phlogiston. What is fire? They were asking these questions, but they were taught this stuff, and they went on and formed industrial businesses. And that literally changed the world. It also propelled us into the problems we've got now. But nonetheless, it's the shape of the change, the pattern of the change. It was chaotic, but in the chaos there is structure. It's self-assembling structure, and that it's emergence. The idea that you can put a lot of pieces together. You might understand the individual pieces, but when you put them together and they interact freely, structures begin to emerge that you wouldn't expect. You can't actually explain. And that's a really remarkable thing. But the whole of biology, your body consists of trillions of basically microbes who decided that they can interoperate, and they'll all do better by operating as an organism rather than as a trillion individual microbes. It's astonishing. It's mind-blowing when you think about it. Your blood, your skin, your kidneys, your heart, your liver, your brain, they're all made of these things that even the individual cells used to be 2 separate organisms. The mitochondrion that gives you all the energy was a free living creature, whatever it was, 2 and a bit billion years ago, that got eaten up by a thing that the phagocytose, it would envelop stuff and then digest it. But when at some point, this little mitochondrial creature was being fed lots of food that it could eat inside this other organism, and the other phagocytosing organism realized that it had this energy source inside it. So all you got to do is keep feeding it, and it gives you energy. And the energy is always going, I just sit here quietly and I just keep getting fed, and I can just do my thing. Symbiosis. Suddenly, you've got the modern cell. Something similar happened with chloroplasts in plants. So you've got this self-assembly. It looks random, but what emerges from it is different, and that changes everything. So it's not strange. It's actually it is normal. This level of chaos. So it's why it doesn't bother me. You know, the issue now is, can we change fast enough to not conduct our own suicide, that's the track we're on.
That was one of the things I was just going to ask you, actually, because, you know, we're talking billions of years in terms of evolution and, you know, revolution, I guess, in some cases, but the time was kind of on our and our predecessors' sort of favor, really. I mean, it was on our side, whereas now working to what is a very potentially very, very limited time scale. I mean, you described there about kind of, you know, below the surface, there's a lot of support. How do you see this becoming a more acceptable thing business-wide? So say for the average medium-sized business, where you have a few evangelists, but they're kind of battling against, you know, closed doors, and there's a little bit of a sort of, you know, feeling of, yeah, we probably should be doing something, but it's a should, not must. And there's still this kind of sort of resistance because, oh, we're a little bit too busy. How do you see these kind of individuals who really want to kind of embrace this and, you know, drive change in their organizations? Is it about commercializing this? Because you talked a little bit earlier about there's a commercial value in being more carbon friendly because there's a process improvement and efficiency. So clearly there's a financial value. Do you see that as the route into this?
Yes, indirectly, I think it is, because you're enthusiastic within your organization. Oh yeah, very Samantha and Eric over there, they're very green, and they would have been tolerant. Okay, that's fine, as long as it doesn't get in the way of your work. You want to set up some office paper recycling, see where everybody starts. That's fine, but just don't let it get in the way of you doing your job, which, you know, that's the world 10 years ago, probably the world as it is now in many organizations. There's a shift going on. There was a significant inflection point, 2019, because it started to become obvious to anybody who was running a business, actually having a few people involved who understand this stuff is quite useful, because we're being asked questions now as part of supplier qualification questionnaires. Do you have an environmental policy? Used to, in the 90s, it was, do you have an environmental policy? You just have to say yes, tick the box, that's fine, you're in. Then it was, are you moving towards, early 90s, are you moving towards an environmental management system, brackets, for example, ISO 14001, close brackets, and you could just say yes. And it was okay. And then it was, okay, you had to send some detail of what your management system was. So just saying you had one. So you get this, you see this set of, it's like, I suppose it's crescendo, moving towards a crescendo. What's the musical term? Arpeggio? Whatever it is. I've got lots of friends who know lots about music. It's quite funny. They all sing with the Bristol Choral Society, whereas my background in music was my brother's punk rock band, The Possessed, but it's slightly different. So I can't remember the musical terms, but you get this ascent of climbing a scale of environmental tick boxes, just as part of being an acceptable supplier. So this has now got to the point, the one I alluded to earlier, that for government contracts, you have got to have, above a certain size, but I mean, UK government contracts are usually above several $1 million. So it's several £1 million. So it often does it's going to apply to most. A lot of local authorities, by the way, have been putting criteria like this in place for some of them for decades. But they, exactly your point, they could see where it was going, but they were very very constricted by what was acceptable within their normal business practice as a local authority in, say, the late 90s or the early noughties. That is shifting. It is a question of pace, but that was the inflection point in 2019. The pace suddenly accelerated to the point where you really need to have somebody in your organization who's on top of this, or you hire somebody in. In health and safety, a lot of organizations, small and medium-sized businesses, they can't really afford to pay somebody full-time to be a health and safety specialist, but the health and safety regulations are so demanding and need to be. A lot changed with the corporate killing. There was 2002, I think, that came in, where the directors of a company were directly, personally responsible if somebody died in the course of work. Had they done something, that made the whole thing suddenly become taken very, very seriously in health and safety management. But in a small company, you can't necessarily afford a full-time health and safety manager. So what you do is work with a contractor, a health and safety specialist, who will maybe spend 3 days, 5 days a quarter making sure that you are operating safely. Similar models beginning to emerge for environmental specialists. So, for example, several of my clients, some will just get me in once a year to do the carbon footprint. I say me, this is, somebody like me. There's one in particular whom I will be meeting at midday to go over their 2022 carbon footprint. She basically will just ring me up with a particular query. What do I do about vehicle mileages? What about freight? This is how the software has developed, the data collator, over the years, because a particular client has a particular problem. Can you cope with this? I think, well, no, but we can add that. So I've now added freight miles, so you can calculate the carbon not just from vehicle movement, but moving 10 tons of freight, 3,000 miles by sea, and then 250 miles by truck. So you can work out the carbon from that. The numbers are all available. You extend the software, you do it. So she hasn't got the technical background to do that, but she knows a guy who has. So I'm being used as a sort of in loco environmental specialist, and they're paying us to do that. So it's the classic make or buy decision for a business. Do you have somebody in-house, or do you buy chunks of time from somebody who's not in-house, but is working with you very closely? So a lot of our clients, that's what we do. That's how it operates. But the logical next step for businesses, we're paying consultant rates. We don't charge that. I would say this. We probably undercharge and overdeliver, which I'm often taken to task for by my colleagues who are much, much more business focused than I am. But there will come a point for a business where they say, actually, we just need somebody in-house to do it. And then you say, well, she might only be 23, but young Olivia over there is really on top of all this stuff. Maybe she'd like a job offer to do something she's basically wanted to do since she was 12. So there is that. That's the sort of shift that I think is going on. The underlying question, I suspect, is it happening fast enough to make any difference to anything? I don't know.
That's the tricky one, isn't it?
That's because I don't know.
Yeah, and really sort of depending which way the wind's blowing and how people are feeling, they'll give you a different answer on a different day. And I think it is a challenge, but it feels like that doesn't really, actually, that's not quite such a pertinent question as I probably thought before this conversation. I think what I'm kind of picking up here is that we're not alone. I think that's the key message, is that if you kind of like, maybe you're the sole kind of, sort of driver in your organization, but hearing Simon talk here is that, well, one, if you can't get the support internally, there's definitely people like Simon externally who can basically come in and kind of sort of almost stand by your side and guide and facilitate, and then maybe, sort of, use something like the carbon lens to kind of, really kind of, so give you that evidence to really back up the storytelling that you want to do in your organization. And obviously to an ultimate position where, you have a team whose sole purpose it is to drive the narrative and do the actions. So it feels like we're more probably better supported than I think probably most people would feel.
That's the root of my optimism. I'm described as a relentless optimist. You have to be, because pessimism is its own self-fulfilling prophecy. You got to, it will work. This is classic chaos. How will it be all right? I don't know. It's a miracle. It just will. But that's your emergence thing. There are networks emerging quietly within the existing business community. The inflection point, the tipping point, was the people at the top of business communities twigging that actually this is where the money is. Where do you think the growth is going to be? The growth is the low carbon economy. Now, they have at least recognized that now, which I think is why there's now a energy security and net zero department. There's I don't think they understand what it means, but they know something going on. Would the minister like to find out what the hell is going on down there below what we can see? Well, this is what is going on. And you look at, do you know about Hornsea 1, 2, and 3? Hornsea is a small town on the Yorkshire coast. We used to play them at rugby. There's a big wind farm, Hornsea 1, which is Ørsted build the turbines, but the mast for the turbines, if I get this the right way around, the footing that goes into the seabed is built, I think, on Clydeside. The masts are built on Teesside. The turbine blades are built by Siemens on Humberside. And Ortley build the actual electrical, mechanical set, Danish. And Siemens is a German firm, but it's got a lot of activity in the UK, so it's very much part of the infrastructure. That's heavy-duty engineering in a high-growth area in the poorest parts of Britain that used to be the epicenter of the Industrial Revolution. Suddenly, as the North Sea becomes the biggest power station in Europe, because Hornsea 1's quite small, Hornsea 2 is now under construction. That's a lot. It's gigawatts. That's tens of gigawatts of energy being generated. You're talking about tens of thousands of, enough energy for tens of thousands of homes from the wind, but it needs quite specialist technique and understanding and technology working in a very rough, shallow sea. Well, would you believe it? We've got all that expertise because of North Sea oil, which can now be reapplied to generating clean energy. Surprise, surprise, the carbon intensity, that is the amount of carbon emitted per kilowatt hour of electricity in the UK grid, is falling by, the last few years, it's been between 8 and 10% per year. So basically there's 8 to 10% less carbon emitted for every kilowatt hour that you use in your heater or your cooker or whatever, because of all the renewables. And there's a massive offshore wind farm generation project underway. Eventually, the plan is there will be offshore islands that will, so that you can run the cables to the UK, to the Netherlands, Northern Europe, Denmark, whatever. The Danish are very big players in this technology. We have a lot of wind. We can do stuff. This is growth. This is serious economic growth. So that is a way to run an economy. But you have to invent it, and you have to make some dangerous, financially decisions early on. But they've done that. Now, the tragedy behind all this, of course, I lived in Sheffield. I was doing my PhD in neuroscience stuff, brain modeling, in Sheffield during the miners' strike. The tragedy of what happened to the mining communities, because they were seen as political adversaries, was just palpable. You could see it. But the upshot of it is that the UK is not massively dependent on coal to generate power in the way that it was. But there's new employment, new growth, new technology in a much cleaner way of doing it. So anyway, I don't know social science. My son's a historian, I'm not. But, the human stories behind this. There's a huge amount of training needed for this at all levels, but that's a growth opportunity in itself. We've been building tens of thousands of homes to a very, frankly, very low environmental standard. Where are the photovoltaic panels? It should be on the roof. Where are the heat pumps? Where's the level of insulation that's possible that could have been put in? They're all going to have to be retrofitted. I'm talking to you from an 18th century quarryman's cottage between Bath and Bradford on Avon. So we've got those are 18-inch stone walls. Somehow we've got to make this house energy efficient. So there's quite specialist knowledge and manual skills needed to insulate an old property like this. The tragedy is we're going to have to do the same thing on new build houses, which should have been built much better in the first place. But there aren't enough people who are skilled enough to go and do that installation. I'm talking, youngsters, kids going through college, and not theoreticians. There's enough of us around. What use to neuroscientists, really? Come on, ask yourself. You need a few of them. You don't need many of them. What you need is people who know how to fix stuff, build stuff, attach stuff, assemble stuff. British intellectual snobbery is very dangerous. We need to actually value people with those manual skills, and we need to train them properly. So there's growth. You've got growth in education, you've got growth in employment, you've got growth in the economy, and it's all low carbon. I rest my case.
So at a very, very local level, I mean, coming almost full circle to kind of where you started, which is kind of, start locally, keep it small, make a difference within your kind of circle of influence. I'm paraphrasing what you said, but I think it is that, the power of this is in your hands, and there is a story to tell. If it is about growth in the organization that you work with and for, says, yes, but as you said earlier, yes, as long as it doesn't get in the way of the day job, but actually now this can get in the way of the day job because there's something really positive that can align, I guess, with a more commercial strategy. And maybe that is the storytelling here, backed up with the carbon data to kind of give that sort of that underlying evidence. That feels about right, doesn't it?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a nice praise job. Before long, it is the day job. And if you're not doing that as your day job, somebody else is, they're going to outpace you. We're going to see a massive, thinking evolutionary biology here, the ones, well, Mark Carney, unlikely green hero, ex-governor of the Bank of England, now UN Special Envoy on Climate, who understands how the financial systems work. A line we use, Future Leap uses quite often, or almost every event, just to put things in perspective. Companies that do not adapt to the climate crisis will go bankrupt. He said that it wasn't, and this might happen. He's Canadian, so he's much more direct. They won't survive. You're going to have to do this. How long does it take for the realization to penetrate a mind that's set in a world that is now fading? To be successful in business, you've got to be thinking. It's like watching snooker players who are thinking 8 moves ahead, 8 shots ahead. You watch them, you think, okay, what's going on in your mind? He's modeling where it is. That's good business management. It's fairly obvious the direction of travel. So it is the day job.
Yeah. So if somebody is listening to this and they're thinking, I need somebody like Simon to come in and just give us that clarity, because Simon talks sense. He's making carbon management accessible to me. I need to find out more. How do people contact you?
The best thing, Carbon Lens is the company. That's the 3 of us who do this, the speciality stuff. So we work out your carbon footprint. Standard output is a net zero plan. Typically, we want to do that every year. You can do. So that's the business thing. If you're really not sure, you just want a bit of background, contact Future Leap. Either of them would come through to me. I talk too much, but it's all there. It's there. The thing to remember, the take-home message is there's an awful lot going on under the surface. And the other take-home message is it's just fun. I got really sick of green Puritans saying, thou shalt not do anything that's fun. Rubbish. This is more fun than anything else. And you meet really interesting people doing this stuff. It's amazing. It's inspiring, actually. So, the advice
and I can advocate the Future Leap Network, because obviously otherwise I would not have met Simon, who's joined me here on this 300th episode of the Neil Wilkins podcast. And here's to the next 300 equally exciting and inspiring episode. So thank you so much, Simon, for being part of this one. It's been really fascinating. We're both listening to your story, but also the passion with which you continue to manage this chaos. And a lot of people, I think, can just learn and embrace that kind of mindset because it's infectious. So thank you very much for your time.
It's addictive. Be careful. Thanks for asking, Neil. I hope that's been some help to somebody.